welcome to another episode of the South African Spies podcast. Today, we are going to pick up where we left off in our conversation with Krijay Govender, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of her own personal life that she shares with us as much as I did. Talking about your time in Oregon, what was that like back then to travel as a young South African Indian, kind of exploring the world?
Yes, 17. I think I was 17. It was really great. I have really strong relationships with my host parents. And interestingly enough, the family that I grew closest to were the Knowles, which was my second host family. I was supposed to stay there for 3 months and I stayed there for 6. Now, what's interesting about them is that they are Mormons. All right. And if you Google Mormonism, you're obviously going to come up with the most extreme Mormon ideas of polygamy and all of that. They weren't those Mormons. You know, Mormons have very large families and a very different idea of Christianity to what I know. But what I learned from them is they're very, very family orientated. And I just simply love them. And we've been in touch for the longest time. And on our 10th wedding anniversary, I took my husband over because he was really tired of hearing about all these stories. I was like, okay, let me show you. And went to stay with my host parents, and my host mom baked him a famous pumpkin pie, and then he was like, okay, it is all that you said that it was. And they're in their 80s or 80s and 80s right now. And then Mormons have loads of children. So they had, I think, 6 or 7, and I kind of slotted in on the 1 year that they didn't have kids. So that was really awesome. And they had horses, which then developed my interest in horses. So where I live in Johannesburg is a horsing estate. And interestingly enough, from that experience, my middle daughter then became a rider. And it's exposing yourself, and I'm grateful to my parents for that, to new things which you never really thought was possible. And then my kid became a show jumper. And I will tell you that generally my husband doesn't allow me anymore to post anything about the kids online. But I did post Jana's video of her because she did really well at show jumping. And there was a South African Indian man, I think he was in his 60s or 70s, that wrote me a message that was so wonderful to hear. And he said in his entire life, show jumping, for everyone that went to the Royal Show and, all those things, I'm bringing back some nostalgic memories for y'all there. The Royal Show, or even the race course, show jumping and horses is the most distant thing from what was considered typically South African Indian. And this girl took to it really well. And this gentleman the South African Indian man wrote the most wonderful message. And he said, now I've seen it all. And I'm so proud because I would never think that a South African Indian girl would be involved in show jumping. Now, just between us, there's loads of Indian girls that do show jumping nowadays. But he said to me, watch that video over and over because his idea of a show jumper was very, very different. And also it's a very elite, or historically a very elite kind of sport, you know what I mean? So that's something that the seeds were planted when I was in Oregon, simply because I'd been exposed to a lot of horses. Mm-hmm. They owned a lot of horses. And they were not well off. That's just the area that I lived in. So it wasn't fast city America that I went to. And it wasn't suburban America. It was kind of like, if I were to compare it to an area, it would kind of be like your Stangers, Stanger in KZN, like that kind of an area. That was in 1993. That was completely, I had to explain to every single person that I was from South Africa. But I wasn't. It was exhausting. I got used to it at a very early age. And then lots of wonderful things came from them. And then I had 2 other host families, which I'm still sort of in touch with, but not as much. The Ballards, they were a family of teachers, and they had a very small family. They had twins, and the Johnstons, who took in quite a lot of exchange students all the time. But it was interesting that the family that I didn't expect to like was the one that I stayed with the longest. And I stayed with them for 6 months, and then we've kind of continued our relationship.
That's so beautiful. That's such a nice thing to carry through the rest of your life, because it obviously gave you so much as well.
Yeah. And then everyone there is not sort of multi-million, not the Americans you see on TikTok. So they still, my host sisters still want to make a trip to South Africa. And then luckily enough, they understand that it's not wild animals and because they are Mormons have a very big thing of going on missions. So they're very worldly in terms of they understand the world outside the United States, which a lot of Americans didn't, especially back then.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Now, you got this exposure to kind of like the US, which is seen as typically progressive and, an entirely modern, different world, regardless of like, the type of family that you stayed with who were more on the conservative side. But then you came back, and when I think I remember actually seeing you on TV and being exposed to you was Isidingo. And I remember it so clearly because, you were obviously one of the few Indian figures that we got to see on TV. And then a scene happened and my mother almost like lost her mind. And this scene was the kiss between yourself and Jack Devnarayan. And I remember it so vividly because my mother was like, "Oh, they're kissing on TV. How can they do that?" And I was like, "But Mom," and I was really little, but at the time I was also like, "But Mom, we watch Bold and the Beautiful and Days of Our Lives and they do way more than kissing. So I don't understand why this is a thing." But from your side, what was that experience like and the kind of feedback you had gotten at that time for that?
It was terrible. It really was. I'll tell you why it was terrible. Because it was a huge deal in the Indian community. And for Isidingo and for my directors, it was just another scene, right? Yeah. They had no idea. It was so bad. So my dad was a very conservative person. I say the worst kind of conservative because he was Christian conservative and he was Indian conservative. So like none of the girls in our family are allowed to have short hair because my dad always said, we're not allowed to cut our hair for both those reasons. The Bible and being Indian girls shouldn't have short hair. So we kind of listened to that. And my sister and my mom don't listen, but I don't have a single piercing. I've never had my ears pierced or my nose or anything because I kind of listened. As I said, I used to just go put my toe on the line and not cross it. It was terrible because I was more fearful of my dad than anybody else. And so when we were doing that scene, only Jack and Jack is like an older brother to me, so that was gross on so many levels. So it's only Jack and I that understood the weight of what we were doing, which is the first time two South African Indians had kissed on TV, in South African TV. And obviously the director wanted sexy lingerie and all of that. And we just said, listen, no, really, just, conservative nightwear is fine, what we considered, absolutely nothing else. And then in my house, this was before load shedding hit South Africa. But in my house, when that kiss happened, the lights went out at home. So my mom had phoned me and she tripped the light switch. For 10 minutes of Isidingo, the lights went out and my dad never saw the scene. And that's how I dealt with it. I mean, I was such a chicken, really. I mean, that was my biggest fear, that, he was going to flip out, and he would have. And it was really funny because I didn't mind that my then-to-be, because I was getting married at the same time that was happening. I didn't even mind if my father-in-law saw it or anybody else. It was just that my dad saw it. My mom tripped the lights. So they never got to see the scene. And now when you look back, you realize how ridiculous we all were behaving, because it was just a kiss. It was just a kiss. But it was huge. And one understands that is because you don't realize how conservative South African Indians were. And it's a good thing to have that. I couldn't handle it. What I feel sorry for nowadays is the amount of pressure that we put and the amount of hate, what do you call it, what the haters or whatever, that young people in any form experience, and I think people forget that on the other side of the camera, on the other side of a podcast, is a young person who hasn't really figured out life. And so from that perspective, it was difficult because we were both quite young, but I was really young to kind of deal with that. It was like basically that we hoard ourselves. Ourselves. That was what some of the input was. And at that time, there was also Lotus that was kind of doing talk shows and all of that. And funnily enough, my good friend Devi Sankri also did a show about, the kiss on TV, etc. So it was big. But looking back, I think the learning lesson from that for everybody is that whenever we criticize people in the public eye, we just need to be mindful of how old they are, because the youngsters don't have the tools or the bravery or the I give a damn attitude that you kind of get, or even the wisdom that you kind of get later on. And then that was it. That was the kiss. Wow.
Well, you say that was also a conservative time and stuff. And I think that part of us is so deeply rooted into who we are and how we grow up in our families. And I don't know if it's changing yet when it comes to those things.
I think there's a range, and I think it's important for each one of us to kind of figure out where we are. For me, when we became parents, we became quite conservative. And then one of the things that we have, we did very early was anything with the university years, which I don't even want to get into. And I'm so grateful that there wasn't any smartphones then, because if we could see any of that behavior, that would backfire in a big way. But one of the things that my husband and I had decided just before we got married, and he wasn't my boyfriend for a long time. He was my best friend on the side, dropping me off at my boyfriend's houses. One of the things that we decided when we got married, or just before we got married, is that we were going to not allow alcohol in our house, which was quite a stand. That came from probably one of the things I'm kind of proud of that we did, because we had a really crazy, wild university life. And I felt that, we kind of drank enough for the rest of our lives. But we had to do it because we could see that there were alcoholics in our family. And let me be very honest that every single South African, it's not a South African Indian problem. It's a South African problem. There's alcoholics everywhere. And we kind of looked into our families and we went, well, there's a whole bunch of alcoholics in our family. Functioning ones, and, not kind of like the ones that are obviously alcoholics, the old uncles that, So we used to talk a lot about drinking out of the car boot, and all of that was great for weddings and all of that. But then just before we got married, we said, okay, we're going to have an alcohol-free house. Well, let me tell you, did that backfire? I mean, look at it in retrospect, right? There's two young people that are saying they're not going to allow alcohol in their house. Do you know how our families went off the rock? I mean, people didn't want to come to our house. And then we knew we have a name for our house that everybody in our families call it rehab because they know that there's no alcohol in our house. And let me tell you what that kind of did anyway. And I think that was quite a smart decision for us. It kind of cut out all our friends that were just kind of hanging out with us.
For the wrong reasons.
For the wrong reasons. It got us to authentically connect with a new bunch of people that weren't interested in getting sloshed. Because that happened. That was university. It was great. This is the next chapter. And then slowly, instead of having dinner at our house, we started having breakfast, or families would come over for breakfast and all of that, which is much better. So we worked around it. But I think that is something that we really need to look at as South African Indians. While we kind of, tap ourselves on the back for being adventurous spirits and going forward, one of the things, I think Muthu Murugan, here's a name that you guys haven't heard for a while. Muthu is an incredible human being. If I could do a documentary on him, besides the fact that he does comedy and is, nobody has verbiage. He just can talk anywhere and rhyme and all of that. Muthu, when you get to know the man, is somebody that has been so involved in saving alcoholics in Chatsworth. And the stuff that he does for the community, I'm ashamed that I don't even do a drop to what he does. And there's a real growing problem. Drugs are on another level as well, because that's destroying communities throughout South Africa. But alcoholism kind of is like the silent thing. I mean, have you ever asked yourself, why does our government ban cigarette commercials? And I'm not advocating for cigarettes, because that's a filthy, disgusting habit anyway. But nobody died on a road smoking a cigarette.
Smoking, yeah.
You know what I mean? By the way, if you look at the statistics of South African road accidents, I mean, wars in the Ukraine and all of that don't even compare to the number of people that die on our roads.
It's quite ridiculous, yeah.
So that's something I think we need to address as South African Indians, because that alcohol problem is huge there. And every kind of community needs to help each other. And you find that in all races in South Africa, and it's growing, you know what I mean? So like I said, so while we're patting ourselves in the back for being very free-spirited, fighter, progressive community, we also have the dark side, which is drug and alcohol abuse. I just lost a cousin at the beginning of this year to drug abuse. I mean, and it was the most pathetic story of, he was married, he lost his wife, he lost his house, he was living on the street, and everybody knew that, it was a train smash. But that was something that never happened among South African Indians, talking about conservatism. So that's where we also need to be doing work.
Firstly, condolences about losing your cousin. I know you've had, quite a number of losses throughout the past couple of years. But, also on that point, the reason why these things are also such major issues is because there's so much of shame attached to it as a person to say, this person in my family is dealing with this and needs help. I don't know how to help them. So the form that a lot of people see as help is hiding it, because you want to save face for that person or for yourself or for the family or, whatever else. And there's just a lot of shame in asking for help in general, but especially with that.
True. And I think that's where you guys, I'm talking about your generation and everyone listening to this podcast and people that are kind of, perhaps better equipped with dealing with those conversations. And you're better equipped because you have the exposure to education, to travel, and to those sort of things. And you've got to put your foot down and say, you know what, this thing about, I think it was a few times that I've said it in my family. Who, everybody knows. You know what I mean? This thing about saving face for who? The problem is getting worse. And just really, that is a younger generation problem. To say to the older generation, I'm sorry, listening to their perspective is really important on deep subjects like abuse and on those kind of things that go on in families. Listening to their perspective is important. But on the other hand, they are not going to ask for help. So you've kind of got to force it and go, times have changed. Okay. And everybody's got so many things coming at them all at once. If we can solve this problem this way, then come on, let's do it. Once again, we all have to learn that with a loving approach, which I find it difficult because I just kind of want to go, come on, guys. We all know this guy is doing this. Let's attack it. But yeah, I kind of learned from other members of my family that it's nicer sometimes, or maybe it's nicer to play good cop, bad cop, in those sort of situations. But it's definitely something that is tearing the community apart.
Yeah, I hope the next generation, because they are a little bit more straightforward, with things and their views, and they can see kind of like right from wrong in most cases. I hope it's something that they're able to encourage with the older people in the families.
You're talking about the next generation. They've got big mouths.
They've got big mouths. They got big mouths.
Next generation person. But they're afraid of moths and flies and all of that. So they also, but never mind. There's nothing new under the sun. So every generation kind of goes through that. So it's important to have big mouths, and big mouths are important to draw attention to problems. And then you need the fixes to come and say, okay, how do we help? How do we fix this? And not just talking about it. And the other thing that I really don't appreciate about living now is that as much as I love technology, I just love it. It's made my life so much easier. Editing before used to be going and sitting for hours, driving so far, coming home late at night, sitting with an editor. And now I can basically, look at things on my phone. I also think that this thing of putting everything out there, it's too much. And one has to have a sense of privacy. And that's why I say, so even family issues and asking for help, I think it's important for families to do that within themselves rather than to go to Facebook and social media and open up. And so one of the reasons I can't stand Twitter, by the way, I just can't stand it because I always think of it as what you basically have with Twitter is that you're thinking that your first thought is your best thought on a situation, and it never is. And you never have context to things, and you respond, I think it was my agent. I think there is a Twitter or X account or something that one of my agents set up for me. But at the beginning, and I was like, you know what? My first thought is not always my best thought. It's always important to reflect. So you're right. And that's why I think that if we're dealing with any issue, even you guys, living abroad and all of that, always have a sense. That would be like somebody that said, don't give people advice. And here I am. But I think it's very important to, whenever you're putting something out in public, to go, let me just rethink it. Perhaps bounce it off somebody that has a different view, your tribe, your circle of friends. Living in Johannesburg, away from our families in Durban, just like you guys have. You guys have a greater extension of that. And those of us that kind of are ex-Durban living in Johannesburg, your tribe of friends become really important to you for bouncing off ideas and things that are going to have an impact on your family and community. So that's very important.
And I think also just making sure that your circles are not limited to people who are like-minded too much, because then you're going to get the same opinion, you're going to get the same views and stuff, and that's not going to challenge your thinking in any way.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Because if I look at my kind of tribe in Joburg, the South African Indian tribe, we are very, very diverse in so many ways, but none of my closest friends are in my industry. They all are in other industries, and industries that make a far greater impact: social workers, teachers, businesswomen, all of that. But it's important to have them there because you always need that friend to tell you things straight. and then you need the other friend to cushion and say, don't worry about her. It's okay. It's fine. But it's important because there was something that was said this weekend in a conversation, which is it's so important to love your enemies. Not just a scriptural thing. It's important to love them because your enemies challenge you and the way in which you think and irritate you. And that's when you step back and go, you know what? It's actually your enemies that get you to grow, not so much your friends. Your friends are really your cushion. So it's important to have people, not that your friends should be your enemies or that dreadful term frenemies, but it's important to make your circle bigger. And I think it's also a way, if you're living abroad, to completely realize that every opportunity and interaction you have could be really life-changing if you include these people into your life or not,
Absolutely. Yeah. That I see on a daily basis. And it's a constant thought when we interact with absolutely anything or about anything with anyone. But talking about the move and living abroad and stuff like that, you've been saying now moving from Durban to Joburg, and you say that you've been there for about 22 years. So this is home now for you. But can you think back to maybe how different that felt moving from Durban to Joburg, and what life was like back then? Because this is 22 years ago. It feels like forever.
So I actually moved under really odd circumstances because I didn't have a romantic proposal from my husband or anything like that. And then because of my parents and my own beliefs on not living with a person before you marry them. And it's not me judging other people that choose to. I think everybody has to live their own lives. But there's no way my dad will allow us to live with somebody before we married them. And my husband had phoned me. He'd been a friend for many years and kind of a boyfriend in between other boyfriends, but that's a different story. And he'd phoned me and he said to me he was going to buy a place up in Joburg. Would I please come up and help him look? So he was going from complex, to complex, and he lived, we were childhood friends from Marion Hill. So I kind of knew how he grew up with a yard and neighbors and all of that. And suddenly he was looking at complexes and he was saying it was for safety in Joburg, which I was very naive and stupid at that point. And then I said to him, why don't you look at a house, And he's like, no. And then it was way over his budget and all of that. And I said, no problem. I'll help you buy the house. Absolutely no thought of us getting married or anything. He's like, I'll help you buy the house. And he said, are you sure? And we saw this house. It's a tiny 2-bedroom house, but a nice big yard. And I went back to Durban. And then my mom said, how was his house hunting? And then I said, he's buying a house, but I'm going to help him. And so my dad overheard the conversation. Why are you living in our house if you guys are going to buy a house together? And then I phoned him and I said, my dad said, if I'm going to own that house with you, I should live in it. And then he's like, okay. And then I also got an audition up in Joburg. So it was out of necessity. And then I went up to Joburg with my parents and got married on that day. We drove up, got married. I have those wonderful pictures. And then the year later, we had a big wedding. I remember we bought a white skirt and a white blouse. And my mom and I had a friend that baked us a cake. And it was really cute. And then there was my sister-in-law's parents that lived in Joburg that came. So our first wedding were 8 people. And then the next year we kind of had what I call the costume wedding, where you can wear the big dress and all of that. So, and we never celebrate the second one. We always celebrate the first one. So people are always confused when we wish each other happy anniversary. They're like, yeah, but we were at their wedding and it definitely wasn't on July 20th. It was somewhere in September, but it was the second wedding. So at first, I think it was extremely intimidating. And anyone will tell you that because the 6-lane highways, especially if you move now, there's a 6-lane highway in Midrand, and then there's more buildings coming up everywhere, which is great and very progressive. But when we first moved in Joburg City, which now is, kind of a no-go zone, and Midrand is Silicon Valley, and Sandton is kind of where all your banks are. So Joburg has changed. Business in Joburg has changed. But what threw me into it, and in the year, there's 2 very different human beings. My husband is ex-engineer, but a corporate worker. So they work in offices, okay? The most dull building you can ever, low ceilings, fluorescent light, horrible situations. I work in the TV and film industry. So I was kind of thrown into night shoots in downtown Joburg very early, and I learned it really fast. And now Joburg to me is South Africa because it's extremely diverse. And I'm not talking about South African traditional races, colored, Indian, black, white. I'm talking about Nigerian, Kenyan, Ethiopian, Pakistan. So I film a lot in the townships. the number of Pakistani guys that are married to South African women that run businesses in the township, that's a documentary on its own. So I've seen Joburg change quite a bit. And I love Joburg because it's hardworking. It's not pretentious. And then I get really hurt when I hear silly things like, on social media, oh, Joburg Indians versus Durban Indians and all that rubbish, because it really doesn't work that way. The only reason that people move to Johannesburg, and the only reason that you move to Johannesburg, is because of the opportunities for work. And the difference is crazy. Durban offers a far better lifestyle because you've got the beach, which we all took for granted, by the way, when we lived there. Am I right? You only did the...
Well, I grew up in Joburg. I was born and bred in Joburg,
really?
so I never had that.
You didn't even have that. Well, if you were a Durban South African, you just look back and you go, you idiot. You had the beach there, but you chose to... you stayed at Blue Lagoon instead of actually going to the beach. So Durban has the trade-off is incredible. You have the lifestyle and lower salaries in Durban. You have higher salaries in Joburg, but you don't have the lifestyle, so you kind of try to make it. And then every opportunity you have, you go down. So I get really hurt. It's an artificial comparison. Joburg Indians and Durban Indians, there's no such thing. And we have enough division as it is. Do we really need that? And by the way, it's not just us. It's not just us. Because if you look at the Black community, they have exactly the same. So when I explain to everybody at work, because, my entire crew is Black, when I explain to them, if we have an Indian actor, somebody, I explain to them, well, actually, that his surname is something. So it means, we're not really from the same original tribe. And next they go, huh. And I always explain it. It's like, just like you guys, when you have like the Gumedes, and I use various other surnames, and then I explain you guys are the same sort of group, but not really. It's the same with every community, including Dutch. I mean, you're going to, you see that in Holland as well.
Yep.
Huge divisions amongst themselves. And then also in Holland, you've got extreme liberalism, and then you've got extreme conservatism. It's unbelievable. I mean, you guys have had a far different mix than we have in South Africa.
No, definitely. We see that here, especially because we're in a very small town that is very traditionally Dutch. So they are they're still old school, and they do things not as progressively as what people come to see when they come to the Netherlands, like Amsterdam and Rotterdam. None of that.
By the way, I told you there's so many Dutch things in my house, and I showed you the clock. I showed you that. And above my bed, actually in my bedroom, there's a painting of Rotterdam before it was destroyed. And I have a Dutch friend living in our cottage at the moment. Whenever she comes up, she's like, her parents can identify that. And the new generation wouldn't able to know it because it was destroyed in the war. But it's still interesting to speak to Dutch people about their heritage, because you notice that in Europe, unlike us, we don't have the reference. Maybe some of the older English and Afrikaner people would know the war, but in Europe, identity is so linked to war, and they always talk about the wars, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, even in their museums and stuff, they very openly put out the information about all the colonies that they had, like Suriname and stuff like that. And we learned a lot just by interacting with some people, because you always think, like, how did the Surinamese people come here? Like, because you look at where they are and it's like, how? And then you hear the stories. And my husband's boss is Surinamese and he speaks Afrikaans, and he was so shocked that we speak Afrikaans. But it's also because of the colonization, they learned Afrikaans like how we did, and it became part of their schooling curriculum. So we could have, like, he struggled to speak English, but then I could speak a little bit more Afrikaans. So when I first met him, we're like, let's not struggle on this Dutch English thing. And we spoke Afrikaans and understood each other better.
Did you teach him the swear words?
I think he already knows them. He was about to teach me some.
Oh, funny.
So I think it is pretty exciting, and it's also nice to see, I think when you're abroad, you start understanding cultures a little bit better for where you stay, and you learn to appreciate the things that in your own country you used to identify with, but also understanding histories and, the ways that the other countries work and how they identify themselves as people is extremely interesting. But we were talking about, Afrikaans and stuff now, and I think an interesting thing about you is that a lot of the shows that you direct is not in English, and you did mention this a little bit, and I find that really fascinating. I just want to understand how you do it.
For some reason throughout my life, if somebody said something can't be done, like stand-up comedy was a male thing when I started it, then I kind of want to prove not them, but more myself wrong, that it is possible. So it's quite silly because I'm quite a simple person that way. And I mean simple in the level of intelligence. If you want to get something done, say it can't be done, and then I'll go, oh, yes. I think my producers have done that.
Does your husband know this trick?
Probably, but my producers know that more because, if we say we're going to do an action sequence, like, for example, on Legacy of dropping an actress from a 17-story building and seeing it, and then they say, oh, but it can't be done, so they just know how to get to me because then I'm like, well, just give it a few days. Let's go. It can be done. We'll do it. You know what I mean? Or doing a soccer match like we did on this new show where we needed 52,000 extras. And I'm like, oh, just leave it with me and we can be done. So the interesting thing about the arts and storytelling, and zoom in on my particular job, which is drama and television and storytelling and filmmaking, is that you could watch a film called Life is Beautiful, which is in Italian, and it will make you cry, just like the way you could watch a Bollywood film and not really have a grasp of Hindi, and it would make you cry. So I directed Sieven Dilan for a while, and I directed Sieven Dilan because it was the strangest thing. My dad had just passed in 2018, and he was a big Sieven Dilan fan, obviously, because it's the most conservative soap ever. My dad couldn't stand Isidingo. And then when he passed, it was a couple of weeks, and I was sitting with my mum and having a cup of tea in Derbs. And then I got a call from Sieven Dilan. And then they were like, hey, Krijay, can you come and direct Sieven Dilan? I put the phone down and said, okay, I'll get back to you. My mum said, hey, you know what? Do it for your dad. Definitely didn't do it for any other reason. And then it was a wonderful experience because I had to then go into my Afrikaans, right, which was pedestrian Afrikaans. It was really bad. Definitely didn't do brilliantly in Afrikaans at school. And then also had my own sort of bias about what Afrikaans and Afrikanerdom and all of that was about. Then you get to Sieven Dilan, who, by the way, are kind of like the custodians of the Afrikaans mainstream language. So the scripts were in Afrikaans, which was great because then I had to pick up my Afrikaans. Something happened where I was like, you've got to be kidding. So in Afrikaans, I was shooting a scene, and in English, I would say Alicia and Krijay. But in Afrikaans, Krijay had to go before Alicia for reasons of respect. Well, I think it was a male and female name, and I couldn't understand it. And we had to call cut. And then I went, that kind of gave me an insight into the way in which conservative Afrikaans communities operate. And then I realized how important Sieven Dilan was as a learning tool for South African kids to learn Afrikaans. Because then I would have just said, no, it's fine. You mentioned the two people that needed to go. I didn't know that there was a reason that my name had to be before yours because I'm older than you or whatever the reason was. I can't remember the details of that. So that was fine. In the other languages, generally the scripts are in English. And then with Zulu, for example, my understanding of Zulu is fairly good. My speaking of it is pathetic. I mean, I get laughed at quite a bit and I don't even try it on set. But most of our scripts are in English, and Xhosa, that was an incredible journey for me to find out about the journey of Xhosa guys into the mountain where they get circumcised and oh my gosh, that was an eye opener. And I was like, South Africans don't even know this about their own culture. So it kind of throws me into their world. So the good thing is that by the time we get to shooting, I've already read the scripts and prepped the scripts, and then the actors and the translators kind of do it in their language. And as the actor is speaking Zulu, I kind of got the translation first. So I know exactly what they're saying. And even if they fluff their lines, which basically means if they make a mistake on their lines, I will call cut first, even though my Xhosa is not that good. So it's just a kind of skill that you kind of develop as a director, and that you realize that the language of storytelling, that is universal. And that the language that you're doing it in is not that important, because as long as you know the story and the emotion. So it's not something that's then intimidated me. In fact, it's because my 9-year-old boy has been on Duolingo. I'm like, maybe I should get on that as well and up my pronunciations of things so I don't sound like an idiot when I'm pronouncing things. So that's why it's not intimidating. So I'm hired more for my skill as a director and a storyteller than I am for the language. Because there's always language coaches that will be shocked to know that even if an actor is a Zulu-speaking actor, for example, sometimes we do need a language coach to help him with, pronunciations and all of that. And they're always happy to have her on. And then the other thing is that I am dyslexic, very dyslexic. So I think that if you are dyslexic, you work far better. I've only learned that recently by reading up on it, that the skills that you have as a dyslexic person, Like for me, it will probably take you 10 minutes to read a 3-page script. It'll probably take me 15 minutes. You know what I mean? Because I just read slower, but I process faster. I've just discovered all of this, and I was so excited when I found out that Steven Spielberg was dyslexic. I think my whole household heard that, you know what I mean? And I watched his interview on it. So I think with that comes advantages and terrible disadvantages, but lots of advantages. And one of the advantages is that your hearing and the way in which you create things are slightly different to a normal person. So the language barrier never intimidated me because I always understood the story, and that's what you're shooting. So I definitely will know when to go close up on an actor because you kind of know the script beforehand.
Well, that's so interesting. No, that makes complete sense. I think that's such a nice barrier that a lot of people would see as doing their job, but it's something that you've managed to make work for you.
Yeah, it's me. And I know 2 other directors. Andre Odendaal is also, he's an South African Afrikaner that also works with me in the industry. And we understand the language of filmmaking and storytelling. And then script is something that we can bring to life. That's why you have, sometimes Polish directors directing American films and all of that. You might not have the grasp of English as he would on his home language, but he understands the language of storytelling.
And that's a beautiful language in itself.
It is. It is.
Well, you do great. I think that's very interesting because I don't know if a lot of people actually know that you direct so many of these shows that are not in English.
I know that a lot of South African Indians are not watching them. Yeah, so Champions, Rebecca, The River, Bedford Wives, just loads and loads of shows from Rhythm City, Seven Delon. Sure, I know I'm missing a few. Oh, Housekeepers, which is like a thriller story. And then something that I really miss is Thandeka's Diary, which apparently is playing on the SABC. Didn't even know that the SABC was still running, which is something that I love. And I'm sad that we don't have it anymore. Was the first sitcom in South Africa, Zulu sitcom, that was about a Zulu family without any political struggle, stories, whatever. It was such a cool sitcom. So they're playing it over and over. And I think South Africa needs more of that. Not everything has got to be epic. Sometimes daily life is great. Not everything has to be formidable and large and, storytelling genius. So yeah, there's lots of that.
Oh, that is very cool. So is there something you'd like to share about yourself that people may be surprised to know?
Yeah, I don't have any piercings or tattoos. I'm very anti-tattoos, which makes me very unpopular. My best friend's son was trying to get a tattoo of his parents' birthday. And I was like, phone me. I'll tell you when they're born. You don't need to write it on your hand. Just keep phoning me. So that everybody finds very fascinating, that I've never had my ears pierced or anything like that. That's a silly thing. Yeah, I think that the fact that I only recently realized, because I kind of went through school being quite a fairly good student, but with dyslexia. So a lot of people... And then that was a shame at school because I was like, really, I remember my English teacher used to say, somebody would say, well, what's the plot of the story of this, whatever. She used to always say, well, it depends which book you're reading, the one we're reading or the one Krijay's reading, because I was never good at reading out aloud. It's something that people don't know about me. Oh, maybe the other thing is that I pray a lot. I really do. I always have, even on those dreadful university days. And I think that's kind of kept me alive, but also that's my anchor and go-to. So in the middle of the night, if something's really worrying me, and my husband hates that, and I kind of creep out of bed, but I don't want to be there, in the room. Like, there's this verse that you should go into your closet, which basically just means a private space. So I definitely pray a lot, and I depend a lot on prayer, which when you meet me, you would go, no way, is this person because I guess I don't give off that vibe, of being a person that prays a lot, but I really do pray a lot. And I'm very anchored in my relationship with Jesus Christ. I think a lot of people don't know that because I've kind of been...
Because it's not something that you fully advertise or you put out there completely.
The other day we were talking on set, there was an extra on set and she had a cross with the lowest cleavage, and the cross was right on the cleavage. You know what I mean? Because she's young, and I'm very aware of this. I didn't want to say anything. I just kind of went there and lifted her chain up while I was talking to somebody else, and she must have thought, "What is wrong with this nutcase director?" And then I said, we spoke about wearing kind of the cross. I'm very aware that I don't want the responsibility of representing a religion badly, and particularly with Christianity, because I'm not a fan of mega churches and I'm not a fan of mainstream Christianity, and my beliefs are really very conservative in that aspect. And there's a lot of things that I think I struggle with myself, because I think the standards that I find are quite high in kind of my beliefs, and I fall short of it every day. You know what I mean? So like, I like having the high standards as something to attain, but I kind of fall short every single day. So I think it's not something that because I don't want to be a representative. And then when I do mess up, and as a human being, I don't want to have that of, oh, but look, as a Christian, I don't want to be a representation, even though I should be. That's a big cross to carry, if you know what I mean. So like, for example, like we were talking at work about, wearing the cross. And I was like, yeah, then you have a day that you're wearing the cross, and then you're sitting there and you're having a big old gossip, and somebody watching you and going, wow, really? Is that how you guys behave? So yeah, but I think prayer is something that if I had to think of what people don't know about me, but if you're in my family, you know that, because I'm always like one of those irritating that people that says, okay, no worries, we'll pray for you. And then everybody's like, oh yeah, roll their eyes. I genuinely do, because there's so many worries as South Africans, and there's so many worries as having teenage daughters. And, I've got nowhere else. If I think I've talked to my husband about all my issues, this guy's going to go, my God, get a life. Because he always says to me, you're thinking too much. And I'm like, yeah, I can't help it. I really can't help it. So it's easier when I laid at the feet of Jesus. So it's always praying about it.
Agreed. I think that's what religion is also kind of there for, is that outlet for the things that you either can't change, you can't help, you can't stop thinking about, you need the guidance on and stuff. And I think that's really beautiful that you do that.
I think I have it on my phone. There's a wonderful verse that says, when my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. And that's what I need. Because especially as a South African living here, your heart is overwhelmed a lot of times. I mean, like from the minute you leave the house, or even in the house, you know what I mean? There's just a lot going on in terms of security, and in terms of being a good South African, and not being judgmental, and not saying these people and those people and our people. I can't stand that language. So yes, I do think a lot about things and try to consciously guess myself. And I'm not one of those people that don't have regrets. I have loads. My husband says, you have too many regrets. I'm like, yeah, because some of the decisions that one makes in life, what was I thinking when I made that decision or this decision? And so I find that prayer is just the best way for me. And I'm not one of those people that needs prayer for therapy. I mean, I genuinely need to talk to God and say, help me with this problem. Or overwhelmed at work, or overwhelmed with kids or parents or anything. And then loss, because I lost my dad in 2018 and I lost my brother in 2020, and he was much younger than me. But had we not had Christ in our lives, and because we kind of have a sense of what happens after death, there was a very quick acceptance, that everybody knows the Lord's Prayer, whether you're Christian or not, which is, our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy will be done. Not my will, but thy will. And that's been a big part of kind of like my journey. Whenever things don't go my way, I go, okay, it's not my will, it's your will. It sucks for me right now, but I'm good with that, because really it's only through grief and pain. It's only through that I don't know if you notice this in life. Whenever you have a smooth day, or if you ever plan something and you're going to go, oh, this is going to go wonderfully, it really is a flop. But that day that you really hectic, whatever, something beautiful always comes out of it. Yeah. So it's so important to have the darkness so that your light can shine.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's no shadows even without light, right? So it is, I don't want to say balance, but that is the scale. You have to have one with the other.
I think you need the other to keep, because it's so, it's like complete darkness is horrible as well. And I mean that in especially in being alone. That's horrible. I don't ever want to have that feeling of being alone. And I think that's why I pray, because I'm not praying alone. I'm praying to God. And I think it's when you are alone, because I always look at like, and we shoot so many on television, we shoot so many suicide stories. So there's always a bit of research into that psychology. What would make a person kill themselves is the loneliness of being cut off from God, let alone everybody else. So that's huge. I think it's very important to pray.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and thank you for sharing that with us. I think this has been an absolutely amazing conversation. Thank you so much for being so humble and so open, and it's just been such a good flowing conversation. Like, I'm so glad that I got to learn all of this about you. Like I said, I'm still fangirling at the end of this, but I think to just round off our conversation, there's just, one question I have left, and that is, Krijay, what kind of South African Indian are you?
A growing South African Indian, also in size. Because I just love South African Indian food. It's my go-to. But, that's aside. Something else you don't know about me. If there's anything else to eat, and in our family, like people will always go for the pastas or whatever. I'm one of those. If there's curry in the fridge the next day, I would rather have that for breakfast, which is so uncultured in so many ways, but I'm that girl. But to go back to your point, a growing South African Indian in that, I think everybody knows this. With hindsight comes a lot of wisdom. And when I look back at being in my 20s and the cockiness and the you think you know it all. And the older you get and the more you live and the more you experience people, the more I realize that I'm a growing South African and a growing South African Indian, because as you say, everyone that looks at me, even in our country, sees an Indian first. And then I feel a huge responsibility to also not just be a growing South African Indian, but also to grow South Africa and to grow South African Indians.
That is perfect.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope it's been great for you. I've really enjoyed it.
You know what? I spent more time with you than I have with my husband. And you know what? It was funner, really. I had to watch one more Marvel movie.
And that is a wrap for this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I definitely feel like there were a lot of things from this conversation that we could all take a little piece of. And until our next episode, Shup, sweet, and aware. Lots of love.